Jack Ferguson is a 7-month-old new owner of a Piper Turbulence. After a successful sales meeting, Jack, his fiancée, and 2 of his employees are ready to go home in Ohio. Jack's call to Flight Service Center was not too terrific.
Alright guys, before we go on the flight, I'll just check the weather this morning, make sure everything's in order.
Okay, can you please put it on speaker? I want to hear what he has to say.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Good morning, Missouri Aviation Weather Center. How may I help you?
Hi, good morning. I was wondering if I could get a weather brief for this morning, please. We'll be heading to Ohio today.
Okay, well, the weather in Missouri is 400 overcast right now. Visibility is about 4 statute miles. We've got light rain and moderate wind. The bad weather should stay in the Missouri area for 2 days, and it'll also move over to Ohio later in the evening.
Alright, perfect. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Alright, guys. It's not looking too promising, honestly. I don't know if I'd be up for the flight. I think it'd be better to just wait it out.
I have family plans this weekend. I don't want to get stuck. Plus, isn't the landing the hardest part anyways?
You have your RFR training. I'm pretty sure you can handle this no problem.
I guess so. Well, I don't know, guys.
Just go for it, man.
Sure. Okay, I'll give it a shot. Guys.
Awesome. Let's go.
Jack seemed unsure of himself, but nevertheless, he still decided to go on the flight. Jack was given a time-off clearance by Flight Service Center and was anxious to take off before that given time. He rushes through the run-up and ends up doubting himself if he had made a total run-up or not. In the end, Jack ended up leaving 2.5 minutes earlier than his given time. During the climb out, Jack takes a quick glance at the fuel flow gauge and sees it indicating 0.
Center, this is Lance, November 5491. We got a problem. We're just off 2-1 out of Lacey Fine Airfields. We got a problem here. I'll need a clearance back to the runway. We're going to be losing an engine soon.
No contact November 54901. Say your altitude.
Just coming through 1700 in cloud right now. We'll be coming back down to get out of this stuff. Clouds are at 1500 on the way up.
Okay, you're cleared for the approach. Maintain 2100 until established. No need for a procedure turn. Suggest you stay on approach altitude. The ceilings have been reported ragged, and that's still hill country you're in.
Jack comes out of the cloud at 1400 ASL, 2 miles east of the approach VOR. The approach fixed onto runway 3 at Lacey Fine Airport. Jack's grip on the yoke is strong, and he is heavily sweating. He is stressed and scared. As they cross the VOR dead center, he calls up Terminal Center.
I don't know how long the engine's gonna keep on going, sir. We're just passing by the VOR right now, and I want to get a right close visual to the runway before we lose power.
Roger. You're clear on the altitude. Maintain VFR when able. You have a slight tailwind for landing on runway 3, shouldn't be a problem. The runway is 6,500 feet long. Call to cancel when you have a field in sight.
At 400 feet, Jack and his fiancée are staring towards the runway and desperately hoping to catch a glimpse of the visible runway. Eventually, they spot the vast sea light, and Jack lets out a sigh of relief.
Center, November 5491, has visual on runway, cancel IFR. Raining off fully hard here, thanks. So long.
At 400 feet AGL, Jack was 2 miles away from the airport, and he realized that he had not completed any checks. With a 10 knots tailwind, Jack was panicking, desperately trying to complete the checklist. After putting the gear and flaps down, Jack was over the threshold at 175 feet AGL and 100 knots. Jack decided to slip the aircraft to lose as much altitude as possible. At halfway down the runway, at 30 feet AGL, Jack loses control and flares, putting the aircraft into a stall. Jack was not what one would call a natural pilot. He had bad coordination and was always getting stressed out easy. He would panic in tough situations. Here with us, we have his first instructor, Mel Drexler, in an interview talking about his experience with Jack.
I was Jack's first instructor. He was determined and had almost 500 hours on 172s before he got his turbulence. He was ready with 172s, but he really wasn't ready with the turbulence. He always had trouble staying ahead of the plane. In a sense, the plane was controlling him. He wasn't controlling the plane. Jack was working towards his instrument ticket. After 30 hours of training, Jack decided it was time to take his check ride against my better judgment. He wasn't ready yet, and I told him that. I think he thought I was trying to squeeze more money out of him, but my motivation is not money. I knew he'd be safe eventually, but he wasn't ready yet. Of course, he failed his first check ride and failed his second check ride. After this, I believed that Jack needed a new start with a new instructor, in which I recommended him Avner Jung. Jung was just what Jack needed, an instructor with patience. After a couple weeks with him, he got his ticket, but he still wasn't ready for the Lance. He would always fly in good weather and with someone for reassurance. If you want my last word about my experience with Jack, I'd sum it up by saying that some people are never meant to fly sophisticated equipment, Jack being one of them.
Next up, we went and paid a visit to Jack before he went up for another flight. After the crash, no one was seriously injured, a little shaken up, but everyone survived.
Mel Drexler? He was a good instructor. We just never really hit it off. Our chemistry must have been wrong or something. He'd always put me down most of the time, making me feel inadequate if I screwed up. He'd come down on me so hard, I wanted to crawl out of my own airplane. After my second failed check ride, the examiner, Daryl Stevens, told me something that turned everything around for me. He said I had no self-confidence, and that I was afraid of making mistakes. He said I was just as capable as anyone else. That's when I realized that what I needed was a fresh start, a new approach, a positive attitude. So I talked to Mel, and he thought it was a good idea to switch instructors to Avner Jung. Right away, this helped, because I was able to pass my next trip ride.
Next up with us, we have the instructor Avner Jung. He was the second instructor for Jack after Mel Drexler.
Jack had been brutalized over that turbo Lance he bought. It was the wrong plane for him at the wrong time in his flying. Both myself and Mr. Drexler handled him poorly under the circumstances. Mel didn't realize at first how badly he was intimidated by his airplane. By the time he got to me, the Piper Lance was his nemesis, and Jack put in his head that he would never be able to cope with instrument flying or the airplane. He said he was ready to give up after the 2 failed check rides, but none of us realized that he had already given up at this point. I felt it was my job to psychologically turn him around. What I didn't realize with Jack is that it was more a turbo lens problem than it was an instrument problem. I didn't know how to deal with that. I pushed him to get through the check rides so that he could get that psychological barrier behind him, but what I should have done was take him on 2 or 3 more check rides in the lands.
What happened during that flight is ambiguous and will remain that way. There are many different points of view on the cause of the accident. Here with us, we have the first point of view of Jack that will let us know what happened according to him.
I saw the fuel flow gauge indicating 0. That's when I knew that an engine failure was imminent. I knew I had to turn around as soon as possible and land the plane. I can't tell you how relieved I was when I crossed the VOR dead center. I was sure I was set up for an easy landing after this. The problem is that it was raining hard, and the VOR being only 3 miles from the runway got me distracted, and I forgot how to fly the approach. When I was finally able to see the runway, I was still at 400 feet and only a mile away. I hadn't lowered flaps or the gear down, and I had a 10-knot tailwind. I think it was about, let's say 200 feet when I started to slip, but we were running out of room. At halfway through, I was still sure I could slip it in more, and that's when I lost control. I think what happened is when I slipped, I applied too much back pressure. The nose came up into what looked like a landing flare, but it was really just a control error from my part. I wasn't that much out of it that I would not remember how to land a plane.
Now with us, we have Laura Brewer, Jack's fiance, and she will let us know her point of view of what happened in the plane.
Jack should have never taken off in those conditions because he was just not comfortable about it. He should have told Bert and Phil to make other arrangements, but the guys are very forceful people and they are older than him, and I guess he was just intimidated by them. And I remember Phil thinking that the takeoff was going to be the most difficult part, even though that's not true. Jack has shown me several videos where bad accidents have occurred in situations like this, and I think he did handle it pretty well. When we got into the cloud, I remember him tapping the fuel flow gauges several times. They seemed to be stuck. But after he tapped them like a couple times, I remember seeing the one that was closest to me move to somewhere in the middle, but I didn't see anything happen to the other one. Whatever it was, Jack was really upset about it, and he told us that we had to turn around and head back to the airport immediately. When we saw the airport, we were too high and going too fast, but Jack seemed to be convinced that he could get us down quickly enough. And just before we landed, I remember one of the guys asking him if he should do a go-around, but he was so convinced that the engine was going to quit, so that just wasn't an option.
This was a point of view of the pilot and his fiancée. Now we'll switch it up a bit and get the point of view of experts in accident analysis. First up, we'll have an FAA representative.
For us, this is a classic case of an airplane that was way ahead of the pilot. He took off in a semi-panic and was a low timer in a sophisticated machine on a tough day. We checked the fuel system several times but found nothing wrong. It would have been unusual for them not to, because the only thing that could make them both read 0 at the same time is when the fuel is shut off. With the fuel shut off, he would not have had enough time to even taxi the plane before the engine shut down. We don't know what the pilot saw, or thought he saw, or claimed he thought he saw. For all we know, he may have been looking for an excuse to get out of these clouds. As for the landing, he got behind the plane and couldn't catch up. He made the classic mistake of trying to force the airplane to force the landing. Regarding the pilot's story about trying to slip it in, it doesn't check out. Eyewitnesses said he came charging down the runway the wrong way, and then tried to land after they were already too far gone. We got the same report from the King Air that was sitting at the north end of the parallel runway. This was pilot error, and he wasn't prepared for the conditions. Hopefully next time, you'll have better luck, or better judgment.
As said by the FAA representative, Jack's story may not have lined up. Did he make up excuses to land the plane? Was he hallucinating? Let's ask the NTSB representative.
We are aware that prejudicial junk occasionally finds its way into our official data. We call it junk because that's what it is. Distorted, factual material that represents an opinion or only part of what actually occurred or caused the accident. We do everything possible to eliminate such reports, but we're not perfect. When a field person acts like a judge and a jury and uses phrases like the pilot failed to, or the pilot was not trained for, or the pilot deliberately, it indicates that the investigator might decide in advance that it was pilot error. Having been a field investigator myself, I can tell you it's not always easy to be impartial. In the case of the Lance, I have to say, unofficially of course, that a wee bit of prejudice creeped into the report. The pilot may have been misled by faulty fuel gauges. If so, he made the right decision to make a precautionary landing. If not, it was a clear case of panic. But either way, it doesn't explain why he flared at 30 feet after using more than half the runway. Obviously, it would serve aviation better if we knew why the pilot flared that high. But our mission is limited, and we have to leave deeper investigations and analysis to other agencies.
Next up with us, we have a representative of NASA, and will let us know what she thought of this accident.
Some accidents are truly pilot error with no further explanation. This case comes close to it, but only on the surface. Consider some of the circumstances. You might come to the same conclusion, but it may be for different reasons. First off, ignore everything prior to the accident. What his instructor said, the failed check rides, his coordination, his personality, they're all of no significance. The FAA and the instructors said he was qualified to fly. What you're left with is an inexperienced IFR pilot who is suddenly put into a life-threatening situation. Then everything turns nastier on him. Heavier rain, reduced visibility, and a downwind landing he has never performed before. Before he knows it, he finds himself over the runway at 175 feet with 100 knots ground speed. With his training, it's safe to assume that he would go around, but let me emphasize this. He was expecting his engine to quit at any moment, so a go-around was completely out of the question. Now put him into a steep cross-control slip that brings him to 40 feet AGL and halfway down the runway. His reflex is entirely correct. Put another quick slip and get it down in a hurry. In his case, it was the first time since slipping that close to the ground is dangerous. 95% of pilots will not try this and do not want to risk teaching it. Most pilots couldn't handle it. Jack Ferguson was no exception. The point I'm trying to make is that the official conclusion said the accident was caused by a poorly executed landing flare. Even though the pilot and at least one of his passengers says otherwise. Well, we'll go with the pilot. His story is entirely plausible. Eyewitnesses are also suspect. Have you even seen what a slip looks like from the ground? It looks like a flare for landing because when the wing gets dropped and the opposite rudder is applied, the nose rises momentarily. The way that the Lance hit the ground on all threes also tends to confirm a slip rather than a flare. We still believe this to be pilot error, but not for the reasons given as the probable cause. In our estimation, the errors took place on the approach, when he forgot to prepare the plane for landing, then crossing the VOR and able to see the ground, he made the most fundamental, most common mistake of all. He went off the gauges and never went back on them. This inexperienced pilot did a classical pilot error, but he was luckier than many and who lived to tell about it.
After the accident, Jack was a mess. He wasn't sure that he ever wanted to fly again. He was sure, however, that he did not want to see the Lance again. Abner Jong took Jack to teach him once more, and they both came to the realization that the Lance had to be mastered, or Jack would never be able to count on himself to fly safely out of anything like a tough situation. So it became the new challenge. After 5 months, the Lance was back in one piece, and both Jong and Ferguson went on a weekend trip and landed at several different airports with different conditions. It worked, because now, according to Jong, Jack is as good a pilot as anyone flying instruments in a high-performance single-engine airplane.
This accident was a clear demonstration of pilot error. It all started before they even took off. Jack was pressured by his co-workers to go for the flight, even though he knew he was not comfortable with it. He just didn't want to be seen as a wimp, so he made the worst decision he could and went for the flight, even though he was inexperienced. He should have communicated clearly to his co-workers the dangers of going up in such conditions.
Jack was already said to be uncoordinated and stressed out in tough situations like this one. This was no different. He let himself fall behind the plane and could not catch up. The plane was always 2 steps ahead of him. Did he read his fuel gauge properly? Did he hallucinate? Did he make it up just as an excuse to go back and land? We will never know, but evidence points to the fuel flow gauge functioning properly.
Even his fiancée reported that one of the gauge's needle moved back up midway. This raises eyebrows. Did Jack ever check his fuel gauge after the initial check? That seems highly unlikely. As the NASA representative mentioned, this could have been critical to avoiding the accident. He could have known that a go-around was an option if he did not think that the engine was about to quit due to starvation. Unfortunately, he truly believed that an engine failure was imminent. Although Jack had established clear and concise communication with the center and knew that he was under the radar, that did not provide him with the comfort he needed to overcome the anxiety that seemed to be clouding his judgment.
After crossing the VOR, the critical mistake he made was not preparing for the approach. His flaps and gear were not down, and he was above the threshold at 200 feet AGL and a speed of 100 knots. According to witnesses, Jack was not slipping. Rather, he flared halfway down the runway. Jack himself and another passenger said that he had slipped the whole way until halfway down the runway, where he made the mistake of using too much back pressure.
Regardless, this was a clear demonstration of pilot error. Whether he flared at 30 feet above the ground or used too much back pressure. As a PIC, he should have been able to determine the problem and correct for it better. Under the intense pressure and anxiety, Jack was not thinking straight and stalled the aircraft.
Corrective measures for this kind of accident would simply be more training and better communication between the pilot in command and passengers. Depending on the student, some may need different kinds of training as well as actual IFR practice and IMC conditions. Until that fear and anxiety has been overcome, the student will not feel comfortable. Unfortunately, some struggle more than others with this and may not be able to fly a plane under pressure. This should be recognized by the instructor and the student and taken into consideration.
On a closing note, one thing this accident makes very clear is a pilot's need for experience and luck. You have to be lucky enough to learn from other people's experience, experienced enough to be able to avoid experience-generating encounters, and lucky enough to survive the situations from which experience is derived. Throughout the lifelong gathering of experience, it is better to be a teacher or a learner than an example.